Well, thank you everyone for joining us for, I believe it's our 51st webinar. And today we have Frank Kirimi, who is going to be presenting on his fellowship experience with the Pratt Institute, I believe, right? Pratt, Frank? Okay, yes, with the Pratt Institute. I'm going to pass it along to Frank so he can give you a little bio of himself.
Thank you so much, Tessa, and thank you, everyone. This is a really great opportunity to be able to share a bit more from the fellowship I did last year. My background is in landscape architecture, and I currently work at Kunkwe Design Initiative. I've been working there for the last 10 years, and my work has been really around public spaces within underserved communities in refugee and informal settlements, but has also expanded into thinking about how nature-based solutions can be used to adapt some of these spaces to climate impacts, climate change impacts. And so I've been involved a lot on using of nature-based solutions in the context of informal settlements, and also expanding into how green infrastructure planning can also be used at neighborhood scales within the informal settlements. And so this was really the basis of my training and also sort of the work and how I got into the fellowship as well. Myself and also as KDI, we've been a part of the NATURA membership from the African node. And so it's been also been a great learning experience and exchange with the team at NATURA. I'm also an early career fellow as well, thanks to the fellowship from last year at the Pratt Institute. So my fellowship really was focusing on thinking about green infrastructure and really trying to draw insights from a city that has for many years been faced with flooding, but also has similar contexts of having communities that are disadvantaged within the city setup, but also a city that has been building efforts into thinking about how green infrastructure can be integrated into the city planning. And so the New York case was really a way of trying to draw examples of initiative projects and also efforts for green infrastructure that could be applicable for Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, which is our area of work. I really wanted to be able to connect this work with the nature-based solutions work that I'm doing in Kenya and Dar es Salaam, and our project funded by Swed Bio called Realizing Urban Nature-Based Solutions. And this work has also been expanding into other projects that I'm going to mention. So to go straight into it, I'm going to take about 15 minutes to just talk through the fellowship and sort of what the objectives of this fellowship, what I was able to learn, what the cases I studied, and sort of some of the learnings that came from this. So the fellowship was, as I had mentioned before, was focusing on green infrastructure, but from the aspect of justice. And this is thinking that from the aspect that urban flooding is increasing worldwide, and there are a lot of vulnerable communities that are really at great risk of vulnerability to the urban flooding, and really seeing the opportunity that green infrastructure has and the broad benefits it has, but also that it really comes with a lot of lacking of equity, and is sort of we've seen inequality being exacerbated as well through green infrastructure planning and implementation. And in a lot of the time, having the communities that are most at risk being left out of these planning processes. So I really wanted to understand three things here, which is thinking about how do communities get involved in the decision-making of green infrastructure in New York City, and also thinking about how can we examine sort of some of the relationships, alliances, coalitions that are coming through the environmental justice organizations as well, and how they are playing a key role in ensuring there's justice in green infrastructure. Finally, and also thinking about how to identify what would be the gaps and opportunities for just green infrastructure in a flood-prone city that would be applicable for the context of the African city. And these were sort of the main three key goals that I had that were driving this 15 weeks fellowship. And I think the aspect of justice mattered from this aspect of green infrastructure, because it's really about not pushing away, but integrating the voices of the people that are left out. I think there are some readings, particularly from Iris Marion as well, who looks at structural injustices that can be exacerbated through green infrastructure, and reminding us that often, I guess, injustices are often things that come from a routine of decision making in the same way. And so really thinking about what aspects of inclusion should be integrated in green infrastructure, and thinking that really true justice is involves a bit of inclusion, and also being able to see that there's shared benefits. So where are examples of this in green infrastructure? And so I was thinking, how could what would be the best way to approach this? I'm not an academic, I'm in practice. And so really my approach was thinking about what are the practical examples, what are the practical case studies. But I also had the privilege of sitting in a class in the last fall semester at the Pratt Institute Graduate Center for Sustainable Systems. And so I was able to really get engaged as well with some of the academic literature out there on green infrastructure and justice from this perspective. And so I was able to draw a number of key concepts to be able to sort of build a framework for what are the key things we can look at in terms of justice in the aspect of green infrastructure. And so one of them that came, I think, came out from the literature was SET, which was, I think is an abbreviation for socio-ecological technological systems. And so one of the things that we could use to really evaluate and think about and holistically in terms of connecting green infrastructure with justice, people, and nature. Another one is also on resilience thinking, which is also very closely connected with SET. And also thinking about particularly of the work that has been coming from the environmental justice work. And finally, there was really some good literature from Qatari, who thinks about these three ecologies that combine ecological, social, and mental well-being within a public space or within green infrastructure. And so these are some of the key concepts that came from this. The other thing I was really looking at is how green infrastructure is being used in terms of urban flood risk and vulnerability. And I think there was really many examples of flood risk, and the severity of this was really obvious in the context of New York, particularly in the environmental justice communities, particularly those living in areas that are affected by cloud bursts, but also those who are close to the coastlines who are being affected by sea level rise. And I think there was also like basically a lot of other challenges that are combined with this that all could date back even from conversations from the Hurricane Sandy. And there are a lot of similarities in terms of Nairobi's El Nino case, where we have extreme flooding within the East African coast. And this really combines rains, poverty, and the marginalized communities really exacerbating the issues they have in terms of lack of proper resilience towards flooding, but also lacking support systems. And so there's sort of similar examples that I could relate with. And so you could see specific groups, particularly Black communities, being affected directly and in great ways in terms of flooding and the associated risks. And so in thinking about this, there was a really big part of the learning that I really needed to look at. What is urban resilience? How is it defined, and how can it be looked at in the context of green infrastructure? And I think I liked what Susan Carter talked about, how how resilience can be looked at in the sense of not just being able to bounce back, but also being able to bounce forward, and thinking about how communities can adapt and really be able to move forward through building resilience. being in New York was one of also a very strategic city in that it's one of the first cities to develop the resilience plans based according with the Rockefeller Foundation. And so this was also looking at what the strategies being laid out. But I also looked at literature by Timon McPherson and the team that were looking at some of these resilience strategies and how are they, providing for justice and also equity within cities. And some of them really displayed clear lack of thinking about these aspects, but also in some cases, even through existing examples of interventions, seeing that a lot of the vulnerable groups are still left out in their adaptation strategies, but also in their decision making. So I started to think about green infrastructure. How is it being defined? Does it relate to green infrastructure in my context? And I just come from working on a project in an informal settlement in one of the satellite cities in Kenya called Embu, where in one of these informal settlements called Dallas, the community had come together to develop a green infrastructure adaptation plan. But in this case, we really worked very closely with the county government, with the municipal government, and they were able to adopt the solution. And they were able to sort of adopt this plan as a solution to the issues of flooding within the community. And so really being able to see how is that green infrastructure definition and how does that relate to the context of New York City. And I think the interesting thing here is that different agencies were defining green infrastructure differently. But also I think one of the great learnings was that really combining nature and green and infrastructure was one of the key drivers in thinking about how to define green infrastructure. And also thinking about how does it serve the communities? How does it restore the ecosystems, but also promote justice? And so there was really an aspect of green infrastructure strategies being one of the ways that could prioritize people, equity, and nature in the context of adaptation and resilience. I think the main thing was that there are, especially like in Philly, where we got a chance to do a tour as part of the class training, is seeing that the definition of green infrastructure is varied, and in some cases, nature is not necessarily looked at. Maybe like the priority infrastructure. I mean, the priority item in terms of green infrastructure. So a lot of it was more around the infrastructure for stormwater management, and not necessarily the integration of nature. Which I think I found something that was something lacking there, but also seeing that what is really driving that thinking. So in doing this research, a lot of it was really in a short time, but I was able to combine a few methods of doing interviews with key people, mostly with communities living in South Bronx, and also communities living in Queens, but also at the same time looking at some case studies and also getting to speak to a few government agencies. But for obvious reasons, I was able to speak to sort of people in leadership at the city level. But I was able to see some of the lessons that would be absolutely applicable in the context of East Africa. So what I did is I looked at them as different strategies and thinking about them as what are the strategies that are being formalized, but also what are the strategies that remain informal. And some of the formal strategies that include, how decision-making are made, how they are modeling the, different scenarios, and how the initiatives are data-driven, was some of the ways people are formalizing even the citizen science initiatives to be able to develop scenario models, but also develop risk maps that have communities input in them. Another formal strategy that I found was the way there was a bit of participatory governance and ways of actually assessing the impact of their strategies And in some cases, think like, for example, within the Gowanus Canal, there are lots of initiatives by CSOs and community-based organizations and also civil society organizations to be able to sort of hold government accountable, but also developers accountable in terms of how they are thinking about flood risk and combining that with promoting justice. I then also looked at quite closely on some of the informal and insurgent practices, if I can call them that, which are sort of what are the communities doing that may not necessarily be categorized as green infrastructure, but really has the characteristics and functions of that. And I could start with sort of like the larger scale of this, which is sort of like at regional scale, which is the community stewardship and land trust that governs the water supply. So from the watershed scale. And so that at that scale, they're sort of a way of really the community coming together to be stewards, but then formalizing this into land trusts. And again, also you can see with the community gardens in New York City that had been in a way formalized under the Green Lab initiative to be able to sort of formalize, but also bring together organizations or community groups that are developing community gardens. And this really resonated quite a bit with the work that Kumkwe Design Initiative is doing in informal settlements, where it works with local communities to transform waste spaces and even vacant lots in Los Angeles into usable spaces as public spaces, as gardens, and also as spaces where they're able to rehabilitate the river ecosystem as well within the various informal settlements. And so these were some really informal systems that were able to provide adaptive responses to the effects of flooding. Communities were, I visited a number of community gardens that had drainage systems that were able to sort of reuse water, they were able to do farming, they were able to train other people in the community as well, including children, and sort of all these informal actions that really promoted green infrastructure at city level, but at really, really decentralized scales. And so I think this is where I made a lot of the focus on, which is sort of this community-led interventions. And I think some of the ones I could note here is, for example, the Garden Rising in New York City, and also the sort of the South Bronx Unite, which is basically a non-profit organization that is born within the community that has been able to develop interventions and designs for physical interventions along the coast on the Bronx side of New York. And so I'm sorry, I'm not able to show pictures now because of the internet, but this was really an organization that had also been able to connect with or an organization or an institution that is able to help them with the design work. So they partnered with a design firm from Penn University that was able to develop their design work. And really, this is looking at how also small scale interventions led by community organizations can connect with universities and other institutions to sort of realize their visions. But so these projects really were able, when I saw these projects, I could really understand how they could use that community power and design to be able to then solve issues that are around flooding, around displacement, and also around how to contribute to the city level green infrastructure. And really, I think the other thing is also thinking about how this relates to some of the work that we were doing in Kenya, which is really thinking about how can you scale the small scale physical interventions at city scale. And so there's an approach we call the rivers and peoples planning approach that really is a way of getting to scale the small scale interventions that the community is doing through planning to be able to get them to contribute to the decision making at city level, and also really advocate for their action plans to be part of the integrated planning. And so really the network of and the alliance of the community gardens in New York was some of these had some of these characteristics that I think one showed the challenges that they experienced, but also the opportunities that are there. Just to think about these challenges really is one is that the whole fragmented planning process, which makes it very difficult for some of the agencies to be able to contribute, but also it creates conflict. And so, for example, in New York, the community gardens and sort of the initiatives that are being driven by the government agencies, some had areas of conflict, and I think coincidentally, I think it was around the same time the mayor was signing an executive order that allowed them to develop housing on community gardens. And so that really created a bit of friction in terms of how the community views the community gardens and how they can view community gardens. I think the other one is the challenge I thought about is also, and I had this as well, speaking to the community, sort of this sort of token participation that felt also that it denies them the freedom. And so how can they, contribute meaningfully into the planning and decision making of the city when it comes to green infrastructure. And this is what actually, in many instances and many examples that I was getting, is that this is how it contributes to the green gentrification, in the sense that they are not really a part of the shared benefits when it comes to green infrastructure. And so the communities, due to this limited capacity for them to contribute, puts them on the shorter end of the deal. But I think some of the key learnings that came from this fellowship is really that there's a lot of strength in informality. I think having been in New York for the first time and not really connecting such a large city with informal systems was a sort of a big relief, but also a big encouragement in seeing how still urban informality at that scale is still vital and really brings a lot of strength in bringing community-led efforts and really showing how to best support and consult with the community. I think I also, which is very similar to Nairobi and Dar es Salaam as well, is that there's a bit of a trust that is required to be able to build the foundation of equitable planning. And so communities have a deep knowledge, they have solutions, but they really need to feel that trust and a sense of long-term engagement as a way of really contributing and being a part of the green infrastructure interventions that would be developed. Sorry. So in terms of how I see this work sort of being embedded moving forward to some of the work I am doing, is that really green infrastructure should include very inclusive and intentional participatory methods that are able to sort of put everybody at, I don't want to say at the same level, but really being able to allow thoughts and voices that are coming from even the marginalized groups really coming out and being included in the conversations. And also thinking about the cross-sector coalitions that are built through the alliances. I think it's just something not very common here, where you have different groups and different CBOs really coming together into one alliance, but also getting CSO organizations, which are the civil society organizations, really contributing to building the capacity and also uplifting the voice of the communities into these conversations at city level. I think one of the key ones that is currently also affecting Nairobi at the moment with the river rehabilitation work that is happening, where the city is really putting together solid efforts of rehabilitating the rivers that cross through the Nairobi city, and seeing that some of the community-based green space interventions are not being put into account. And so a lot of the time they're being left out and not seen as part of this the city scale in solution. So really, I think that's one of the things that was very similar in the sense of these spaces are not protected when you think about, or when you have city scale intervention for greening. And then I think the aspect of equity really cutting across the two cities as well, but particularly in New York, how can equity be embedded in some of the in the planning process? So I think I had the opportunity to be able to attend a number of coalitions organizing events, and you could see that really one of the emphasis is on the aspect of equity and people really showing examples of where inequality has caused different challenges when it comes to green infrastructure implementation. So one of the things I've done from this training and really learning from this is I'm developing framework that I'm currently putting into practice in our training. So at the moment, I'm training about 5 groups in 3 cohorts throughout the year, together with my colleagues, but in partnership with UN Habitat and Public Space Network and another organization that is leading the one called Dreamtown. And their efforts are really thinking about how can the youths, through their groups, contribute to the adaptation plans and really advocate for this local level community-led adaptation plans to be part of the city scale intervention. And so a lot of the learning that has been coming from this fellowship has contributed to that. I'm going to stop there and really, if there have been any questions, I'm happy to respond to those. But I will also be able to share more in the coming days from the overall report. So back to you, Tessa.
Thank you so much, Frank. Yes, he's right. This is now a time for questions. So if you have any, please go ahead and speak up.
Yes, sorry, I just wrote an essay in the chat, but thank you, Franklin. This is Veronica. I wanted to ask you, in your experience researching or just, being here in New York City, can you say a little more about if you learned anything concerning the fact that, in many disadvantaged neighborhoods, there are often more pressing needs than green infrastructure, such as the provision of healthcare, fresh produce, affordable housing. And when the city agencies are so sort of reluctant to provide these necessary services, and they come in planning for green infrastructure, often citizens are reluctant in participating in these meetings, or even if they do, they speak out about other more pressing issues than GI. So I have a few questions here for you. In your experience, how do these tensions influence decision making for green infrastructure, either here in New York City or in Dar es Salaam? Can cities deliver on green infrastructure in disadvantaged neighborhoods when there are so many other issues that seem more pressing? And also whether you have encountered best practices from CBOs in creating alliances that embed the benefits of greening with other pressing socioeconomic needs to push municipalities to deliver on all of those and not just greening. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think it's definitely really like a thing to think about, but it's really an obvious question that comes up when we're doing these engagements. I also got to really engage with communities that are already doing green infrastructure work that is not necessarily seen as green infrastructure, which was the community garden spaces. And so this is the space where I actually saw the combination of the functions and the benefit of green infrastructure alongside livelihood activities. So for example, communities growing food at the same time in a space that is managing stormwater. And so while it's not really an obvious thing that they would mention, from their perspective is they're really looking at what what are the benefits, the direct benefits they can get. And I think this is something that can be borrowed when you're thinking about green infrastructure at city scale. So you're not thinking about fancy parks or solution or NBS interventions that do not necessarily contribute to other benefits. So how do you link these interventions with the needs that the community has directly? In the case of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, we have also encountered the same thing when it comes to designing nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, where the groups really are focusing on their immediate needs and really thinking about how can you combine the benefits and the functions of the nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. And it's the immediate need of the community. I particularly from one of the groups called Rainbow Garden, there's a combination of really an elderly generation and an even younger generation that had a very different perspective of what the green infrastructure can do in terms of and even in their immediate needs. And so that there's also like that intergenerational perspective of thinking about green infrastructure and the benefits of it within the space. So I think that's how I can respond to that. I think best practices I found, especially with the environmental agency and at the city in New York City that I think had a strategy called Open House. So they had a session where they're able to invite groups, and sort of individuals and within a space where they have different ways of showcasing the interventions, explaining what the functions of the different interventions are, but also showing where the risks and hazards are. And so there are different forms of displaying this information. And I think to me, that felt as one of the best practices of involving communities in decision-making, where they had translations, they had videos, recordings, they have different drawings, they had board games. So different methods of bringing people into the conversation. So that would be one of the best practices that I think would be really relevant for being able to get multiple, I think, perspectives and opinions on the interventions.
Any other questions for Frank?
Hi, Frank.
Okay.
I have a, sorry.
Oh, no, go on. I'll go after you.
No, okay. I have a few, but I'll start with a short one. Thank you, Frank, so much. You started your presentation saying that there was some thinking, some bridging you were making between New York City and Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And there was one I was wondering about. We are talking about very different contexts here in terms of climate, in terms of politics, in terms of social context as well. I'm wondering whether you have reflected on the motivations behind people's engagement to work in community gardens and how they might, in New York City, and how they might differ with places you have worked in Nairobi, notably.
I think not very much. And that was, I think, one of the strange things that of course, my anticipation is that there would be very different perspectives and viewpoints, but also in terms of approaches to greening. But I also noticed that there's a lot of commonality when it comes to having your own agency in improving your space. So I think whatever the sort of the drivers that the community in New York used to end up with the community gardens, which is really like to reinvest in spaces that are being quickly disinvested, and really trying to make good use of those spaces and changing spaces that where crime or waste dumping is happening, and trying to transform those spaces into usable spaces is not very different from the motivation that I see with the communities that I've worked with here, who are also being driven by the same, that we have these waste spaces that we cannot really build on. The government is not doing anything on these spaces, but we can really change these spaces into usable spaces. the idea has been a big part of really supporting groups in converting these waste spaces into public spaces. But it was interesting that when we conducted a competition in a different project, we invited groups that are already developing their own initiatives and really telling their story about what they are doing. And you could see that even on their own, there are sort of groups that are able to do this. And so this is where the difference comes in that what they are able to do within sort of like the context of the city here and sort of the amount of resources that are accessible to them is slightly different from the resources that you find in New York City. So the groups are able to do more, right? But also the groups in New York, I think, are confined with a lot of other sort of stringent legal processes around that that I think may not be present here. But I think that also helps the groups really quickly formalize their systems, but also get a lot more support amongst each other. I think sort of looking at sort of the constraints that in terms of law, legal, and the demand for land and like the housing situation, the spaces that we've in New York were slightly different in the sense that they are really pushing forward to developing or getting into land trusts to help protect these spaces, which we do not find here in the sense that there is no possibility of land ownership. So they don't have the tenure to really own these spaces longer. And so you have spaces in New York that are community gardens that are older than 20 years, but here they're not as long term. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Right. Franklin, thank you so much. I was wondering a little bit along the same lines as Loan's question, but then a little bit more like personal, what you feel attached to, or when it becomes difficult for yourself, or what in what way people challenge you or even ask your own emotional response. I'm a little bit curious about that, not because of wanting it to write in the newspaper, but I can think that it's quite challenging what you've been doing, and also in quite a short time frame for yourself. Can you say a little bit about that? How you have conversations with colleagues to work through stuff, or to figure out how you could respond or relate to people? I think that's an important part of the work, but not so much, and I'm not talking about you specifically, but sometimes I think it's important to also explain a little bit about that. Can you answer can you say something about that, or is that?
I could, because I think so. The main motivation for me really to do this is that I could see examples of how people maybe used the sort of the aspect of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions to sort of alienate people from the spaces. But I also saw, especially in the case of looking at the Brooklyn where I was staying and going to the Bronx as well, that communities that have really long suffered or really been exposed to all these impacts, contributing to the decision making of what the spaces could be, but really only to the extent of that decision making, not to the extent of really realizing the benefits. And so a lot of the spaces really are endangered in terms of people feeling that they will be displaced. And in some examples where I found really good green infrastructure examples of projects, the communities that might have been part of this division that do not necessarily live or can no longer live in those spaces. But I found some really successful ones where communities are still part of these spaces. And so I think it was challenging for me to think about this at the same time when we were having demolitions happening in Nairobi within the rivers, and really communities being given 48 hours to vacate within 60 meters, 30 meters of the river riparian, so that we have tree planting. And so really, I was really thinking about how these communities get to benefit from this green infrastructure. And is there a solution? Is there a way that green infrastructure can incorporate the communities beyond just the participation of the decision making, to actually realizing the benefits into the future, as opposed to ending up with beautiful riverfronts that really do not include that community? But I think what was mentally challenging, if I can say that, is also that the history of the challenges, or the history of being in these spaces is not necessarily recorded throughout. So you have people who come into a new space and don't understand sort of the challenges that are there, or sort of how these interventions are being realized, and not really being able to connect with that. And I met some artists who are able to try and embed even the existence of some of the rivers and streams and green infrastructures in these spaces by really painting and drawing out with communities. So I think that's some of the things that were a bit challenging for me. But I think there's a lot more to unpack from this. I've tried to put together some write-ups and sketches for this that I would really be able to share. But I think there was a lot. It was a lot to take in from being my first time in New York, but also seeing how advanced this work has gotten.
Thank you.
All right. I think, Frank, if you feel comfortable with this, if you could put your email in the chat, and maybe anyone else who has a question can send that to you. Well, also, Loan, did you want to mention a note on the survey?
Yeah, sure. So if we're closing the presentation and Q&A, I just wanted to ask everyone if they can take a few minutes to fill in our final evaluation survey that I shared in the chat, but I'm going to share it again for those who join later. It shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes. And we invite as many people as possible to conduct that survey, to fill in the survey, regardless of your level of participation. So even if you feel you just joined a few webinars last year, we still want to understand how this might have been useful, or how we can improve in the future. So please fill it in, but also share it with anyone you know who is part of NATURA. We haven't had enough answers yet. We will keep the survey open, but we are in the final days right now, so really trying to have as many people as possible filling it in.
Thank you. And thank you, Frank, for presenting. That was such a wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot. Sounds like it was a great experience for you. And thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye then.
Right.